I mentioned I'd talk about the safer design guidelines. Those resources obviously, or that resource is obviously available on the Community Crime Prevention website, and I'm aware that the guidelines also require you to consider those safer design guidelines as part of your application, and those guidelines are of course and they're really connected to those kind of underlying principles for CPTED. So there's a really good rationale for adhering to those principles, and I'd strongly encourage you to demonstrate, obviously, that your project does that. What does the evidence say around CPTED? Because it's kind of a collection of different types of responses, very specific design responses, the collective evidence isn't as strong as for CCTV and lighting in terms of the amount of evidence, particularly in public spaces. A lot of this evidence around CPTED actually comes from residential areas, and prevention of burglary is pretty much dominated by the UK. But it does, Rachel Armitage has just done a review, a systematic review of lighting, and has looked at it in terms of the different principles for CPTED and safer design, which she identifies 5 as opposed to Paul Cousins' 7, and then sort of looks at the overall quality of the evidence there. Essentially what she concludes is the strongest evidence is around controlling people's movement through public space and limiting movement, particularly in residential areas. The applicability of that to public spaces is perhaps somewhat questionable, but certainly controlling movement and influencing movement through public spaces, there's really good evidence that says that can reduce crime. And the physical security part of CPTED, which when you're talking about CPTED is not about creating fortresses, it's about good design but controlling access through good security as part of an overall response, and there's really good evidence that says that works as well. Surveillance, when they talk about surveillance in terms of CPTED, talking about natural surveillance, and there's some really good quality studies that say that improving natural surveillance can reduce crime as well, so it's another important principle to try and consider and I guess integrate into your response. The evidence around defensible space and territoriality is not actually as good in terms of creating spaces that sort of communities of, they sort of take control of, they feel pride for, and they're kind of activated to look after. The evidence is not so strong there, and the evidence is actually not so strong around image management and maintenance in terms of kind of the overall appearance of public spaces and the impact on crime. It is, however, really important in terms of reducing fear of crime. So you've got to think about these in terms of what your overall objectives are and what the problem is that you're actually trying to address. But certainly there's some good evidence that says CPTED can be effective as a response, and that design aspects of the design are really important in terms of how you implement CPTED, and following those principles that are kind of well accepted as kind of core to CPTED is clearly really important. And we essentially concluded the same thing. We did a review, as I mentioned before, a few years ago, looking at particular crime problems, and essentially said, well, of course we said this, researchers need more research, but there's really good evidence that says CPTED can work, and we found it worked in terms of reducing theft, personal theft, in terms of reducing steal from motor vehicles, and actually also in terms of reducing property damage. Although the evidence wasn't hugely strong, certainly there was some evidence that said it could reduce those particular types of crime. And I mentioned the Tackling Property Damage Guide at the beginning of this presentation, and certainly that's in there as one of the responses to consider. So if you are looking at graffiti prevention through CPTED, I'd certainly encourage you to look at that resource. I also mentioned earlier around the role of collective efficacy, and this is where CPTED becomes really important. So the whole idea of second generation CPTED, which you may have heard about, is it's not just about design, but actually about community, and sort of combining the idea of improving the design, but also engaging the community, investing in communities, and encourage community kind of cohesion. The evidence around that is not so strong, but what we do have is really strong evidence that if you can build collective efficacy, you can reduce crime. We don't know how to do it. We know if you don't have it, it's a bad thing. And we know if you do have it, it's a good thing. But that's the main, I think that's the evidence is still strong enough to target as a particular focus. So if you can build up that level of community cohesion, bring communities together, there's evidence that can work to reduce crime. We're about to publish, I mentioned a public housing project earlier. Our finding there was that the reason that violence went down was because actually the collective efficacy that had been built in that community was what was sort of reducing violent crime. So it's just this, there's some promising signs around that whole community cohesion argument that's probably not been as well supported in historically. So something else for you to certainly consider, particularly when you're starting to talk about community engagement. Okay, so that's essentially an overview of the evidence. Really strongly encourage you to engage with that evidence in terms of your application, and think about the suitability and the applicability of that evidence to your particular project or your particular local community. But There are some other questions you need to think about, and I just want to summarise this section by talking about those. First of all, obviously you need to think about what evidence is there. I've just gone through that evidence, and so absolutely make sure you're familiar with that evidence in terms of the responses that you're implementing. Think about how your intervention is supposed to work, so it's kind of the underlying mechanism, so be really clear about that. But there's some really other important questions you need to consider, and I'd strongly recommend you try and address. One is, does it actually address the problem? So connect your problem with your response, and be really clear about how your particular intervention is going to deal with that. Give some consideration to how difficult it's going to be to implement. Can you actually do the project that you're seeking funding for? How realistic is it likely to be? Does it rely on anybody else doing something? Really important. So many projects fall down because it was contingent on somebody else taking action, and that hasn't taken place. Will it require something else to happen? I don't know that that's necessarily so important here in terms of high-level policy changes, but again, something that can fall down is whether there's potential legislative, be they local council or higher-level regulatory kind of barriers to what you're doing. How will it interact with other interventions? Really important in terms of public space design. What else is going on in the community that might impact positively or negatively what you're proposing to do? How will other people react, including the community, the stakeholders? Are they going to like it? They're going to hate it? They're going to react poorly to it? And really, that needs to be something you demonstrate through your community engagement. Are there any potential negative consequences that might occur? I mentioned displacement, being really open about the potential for displacement and demonstrating that you've actually given some consideration to how you might mitigate that risk. And finally, and really importantly, you've got a 2-year project which you have to evaluate up to 2 years, that you have to evaluate at the end of it, I think after 1 and a further year. You need to be able to think about, well, is your project actually going to produce results within that time frame so that you can demonstrate the impact of what you're doing. Now, fortunately, you're all applying for public safety infrastructure projects, and they tend to be pretty quick in terms of their impact once they're actually implemented. So the likelihood is that the results will be produced in the short term.